Let me begin just by showing you a facsimile of the cover of the book, which, as you said, will be published this month by Mantua Press in Vancouver. It is my second attempt at political writing, and presumably not my last, at least I hope not. I'm mainly preoccupied in this book by two issues. The first is what I might call the leftist sellout of the State of Israel, which is not only the sole democracy in the Middle East, but also the most energetic, the most vibrant, the most individualistic, one of the most individualistic and vibrant states in the world today. It's very much like the Middle Eastern version of Silicon Valley. It provides the technical engine that powers most of the devices that we use today that we are not even aware of. This camera, which I'm sitting before, it was probably developed in Israel, or the technology that goes into it may very well be Israeli technology. Every cell phone that we use has an Israeli technological heart. The Google search algorithms were developed in Israel. Some of the major medications in the world today were developed by Teva, which is the largest pharmaceutical enterprise in the world, and is doing enormous work, good work in the world. And we could speak about so many other things as well, desalination projects, etc. There is, for example, this movement around the world by unions and churches and universities to boycott Israel, or to divest from Israel. But if Israel should boycott or divest from the world, if it worked the other way around, you couldn't use your cell phone, and your Google would run out pretty fast and have to invent something to replace the search algorithm. And various medications that are used, for example, to treat diabetes and other critical diseases would suddenly no longer be on the market, and people would have to find alternatives, which are not easy to come by, take years to develop. This is Israel, and this is the state that the leftist contingent in the world today has decided that it must boycott, it must target, along, of course, with its Islamic allies. Why should this be the case? Why should Israel be called an apartheid state when it is not an apartheid state? It's one of the freest states in the world today. And the answer to that question is that Israel has now become the collective displacement for the hatred of the Jew. In other words, what we now call anti-Zionism is simply a displacement of anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism by proxy. Israel has become the international Jew. Anti-Semitism undergoes various transformations in the course of history. Most recently, it was considered a racist phenomenon, right? Jews were considered to be members of a race. This was, of course, the Aryan perspective, the Nazi perspective, the fascist perspective on Israel. Now we don't speak about racism in that sense anymore. Suddenly, Israel has become the ideological equivalent of a philosophy that the left, which is ubiquitous, no longer wishes to accept. In fact, the philosophy which the left considers to be individualism, neoconservatism, classical liberalism, which, whether Israel is understood as a Jewish state or not, is essential to the Israeli national character. And this is, I think, one of the reasons that Israel is targeted by the international left, but also because it is a way in which they can slip anti-Semitism under the wire, so to speak, and attack Israel not as a Jewish state, as such, but as an apartheid state. It's the same old anti-Semitism, which simply undergoes different variations and transformations and metamorphoses over the course of time. And we should not deny that. We should not allow that to deceive us. I know that is happening, and that is one of the reasons I've written this book, to analyze that phenomenon. That is a major issue. The second issue I deal with in this book is the Jewish anti-Zionist sellout of the State of Israel, because some of Israel's worst enemies, most vindictive and most venomous enemies in the world today, happen to be Jews. Those whom I call the so-called, in scare quotes, the good Jews. People like Richard Falk and Richard Goldstone at the United Nations, people like Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein in the United States, people like Nev Gordon and his multifarious crew in the Israeli universities, people like Avi Shlaim in London, who is also a Jew, people like Ilan Pape, who is also a Jew, people like in Canada, we're speaking in Canada now, people like Judy Rebick and Naomi Klein, who are also Jewish, and they are amongst the most bitter and rancorous Jew haters in the world, and they themselves are Jews, and they do not understand what Amos Oz, a great Israeli writer, who is also of the left, but what he said in a recent book of his is that the anti-Semite never made a distinction between which Jew he killed. He could be a rabbi, he could be a Bolshevik, he could be a secular leftist, he could be anything at all. He could be a poet, he could be poor, he could be rich, it doesn't matter. All Jews are lumped together as Jews when they confront the barrel of the gun. And this is what Jewish Jew haters have not understood, that they would be amongst the first to go, or if they are lucky, in an anti-Semitic pogrom of the kind Hitler had envisioned, which is universal. If they are not the first to go, they would be the last to go, but they would go. And so I spend some time, several chapters in this book, analyzing the complexity of this peculiar relationship in which the Jew turns against his own people or her own people, and in so doing, without being aware of it, turns against himself or herself. This is a phenomenon that is historically ancient. It goes back thousands of years. The Jew who hates his own. And of course he becomes, or she becomes, the perfect kind of camouflage or cover for non-Jewish Jew haters who say, you see, there are Jews themselves who agree with us, therefore we must be right. That these Jews don't understand what they are doing, but it is a phenomenon that has a very old pedigree, and it's very complex. There's no single explanation for this, but it exists. It's a historical fact, and it's with us in the present moment. And so the second issue that I'm dealing with is not simply the leftist sellout of Israel, but the Jewish sellout of Israel. These are the two subjects of this new book, Hear, O Israel. And, well, would you have another question for me?
Yes. Could you explain the title?
The title, Hear, O Israel. It goes back to the Old Testament. It's a prayer. It's the Hebrew Shema. Hear, O Israel, it's translated in many different ways, but Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. When I adopt this prayer as a title, I think of Israel not simply as a country. I'm not speaking to Israelis as such. Israel is the name of a people, as we know from the Old Testament. Israel was the name that the angel gave to Jacob after the great wrestling match, which lasted an entire night. Jacob at least managed to stymie the angel of the Lord, who afterwards blessed Jacob, crippled him in the thigh, and blessed him and gave him a new name. And the new name was Israel, which means he who contends with the Lord. The struggle is inherent in the Jewish faith. So when I say, Hear, O Israel, I'm speaking to my own people. I'm not just speaking to the state of Israel, the Jewish state in the Middle East. I'm speaking to the Jewish peoplehood, whether they are in America or in Canada or in Israel or in Nunavut or anywhere. I'm speaking to a people. I'm speaking to my people. And I'm saying, listen, this is what is happening in the world today. You are involved one way or another. Understand it. And I'm doing my best to understand it for myself, because it is an incredibly complex, intricate, and obscure phenomenon. Why is the Jew universally hated? Since almost the beginning of recorded history, why should this be the case? And why should Jews hate themselves? I think I arrive at least at tentative or approximate answers, because no person has a lien on the ultimate truth. But I make the best effort that I'm capable analyzing these questions.